Welcome to our weekly maritime video blog. I'm Corey Ranslam with International Maritime Security Associates. This week we're talking polar codes. The polar codes and polar navigation and exploration is a topic that we haven't really discussed much on the video blog. Last year, towards the end of the year, we did a blog about the Coast Guard icebreaking operations in Antarctica and just talked a little bit about the Coast Guard and their operations in Antarctica. We thought that it would be a good idea today to talk about the polar codes and polar navigation and safety in a little bit more broader and general terms. Over the past few years, we've seen the sea routes open through the Northwest Passage of the world through Antarctica. And back in 2016, the cruise ship, the Crystal Serenity, actually took passengers through the Northwest Passage from Alaska to New York on a very, very interesting voyage, and really the first major cruise ship voyage through the Northwest Passage. Since then, there's now a number of tour operators that are offering passage for passengers, whether it's on cruise ships or smaller cruise vessels that cater to very high-end itineraries, and also large yachts that are available through charter of this region. Also, we've seen the number of cruise ships and large yachts interested in actually undertaking charters through the Antarctic region over the past few years go up as well. So with that, the IMO has developed and instituted what they call the Polar Code to help guide mariners who are taking vessels through both the Arctic and the Antarctic region. Now, it's difficult to try to lump the codes for both of those regions together. The IMO has created that initial framework, but as you know, the Antarctic and the Arctic regions are very different. The Arctic region is really an ocean that's surrounded by countries that make up the Arctic, whereas the Antarctic is just the opposite of that. That's actually a continent that's surrounded by ocean. And how the ocean ice works in both Antarctica and the Arctic region is a little different, where we see most of the time the ice in Antarctica associated with the continent will wax and wane depending on the time of the year. However, in the Arctic region, there are certain times of the year now where the ice is completely melted that opens up that passage to shipping traffic. Back in 2016, in the summer, the Crystal Serenity was the first kind of large cruise ship that took that passage for passengers from Alaska to New York. So it was pretty interesting to see that happen. Now with that, on January 1st of 2017, the International Maritime Organization instituted what they call the Polar Codes. There's two pieces to the code, if you're not familiar with it. There's a safety piece that was born through the IMO's Maritime Safety Committee. And there's an environmental piece that was born through the IMO's Maritime kind of pollution committee. So there's the two pieces that we have to the Polar Code, and this is really, as with everything, will become part of and has become part of SOLAS and will move forward and continue to evolve as we see more shipping traffic and pleasure traffic in both of those areas. And we'll have links to the IMO website so you can get more information and a lot more detailed information. The IMO has put out, it's about a 50-page document that details the Polar Code. There's 12 chapters within the code for the safety side, and there's 5 chapters within the code for the pollution side, and we'll talk about that just a little bit in a moment. The IMO, through the Polar Code, classes vessels in 3 different classes: an A class, a B class, and a C class. So the A class vessels would be vessels like the Coast Guard vessel that does icebreaking, that have the ability to do icebreaking operations, have the ability to be really ice class vessels that can survive in medium, what they would consider medium ice levels. The Class B vessels are the vessels that fall outside of that would still be considered vessels that can go into the ice, but they can go into what they consider the thin ice. And then the C are basically the other vessels that can navigate through this area, are typically open water vessels. So those are the class of vessels that are addressed within the code. One of the things that we've seen now, and I would be willing to bet that this is going to continue to expand, is we've seen the classification societies now step up to take the code to provide certifications for the vessels within their class as polar certified vessels. The two leaders that we've seen come out right now in the class society are the Lloyd's Registry and DNVGL. Those are two of the bigger class societies that are moving forward to class vessels within the ice class. And the other day I read something where I believe the DNVGL class has over 4,400 vessels that have the polar certification. So the class societies, I think, moving forward in the future, as they are now, are going to play an important role in classifying vessels when it comes to polar operations. So what is going in force this year in 2018 on July 1st are going to be the training requirements. The training requirements is really focusing on bridge personnel, navigation personnel when it comes to the vessel in these different regions. So within the size categories of the vessels that will be going into these regions, which is basically that 500 gross tons and above, the bridge personnel have to have gone through the training. The training is a 5-day training course. There's a number of training schools that have stepped up now to be able to offer that course to people. Within the Polar Codes, this is all defined within Chapter 12, and it also falls within the STCW. So if you have a large yacht or you're part of a bridge crew on a cargo line or a cruise line, you'll want to look at, especially if your vessels are going to be going into the polar regions, to make sure that you have the training in polar operations as defined in Chapter 12 of the Polar Code. So there's also some other requirements that are laid out within the code, whether it's the pollution side or the safety side of really vessel operations, to get all mariners to start to think along the lines of preparing vessels to be able to go into these different regions. And there's different things throughout the code. We could probably spend a video blog on each chapter. It's fairly extensive, and this will also flow through eventually probably to flag state regulations as well. There's an interesting piece in the Barents Sea that's been adopted in a couple of portions in the Barents Sea where there's also mandatory reporting. And there are 2 VTSs in different regions. We don't have the map, unfortunately, of this to show you where it is, but if you are going to be transiting in the Barents region, you also have to make sure that you are reporting with the appropriate VTS. Along with that, the polar region is interesting from a search and rescue capability. As everybody who watches this channel knows, I spent 5 years with the Coast Guard. In most regions in the Caribbean, around the United States, even in certain parts of Central South America, the Coast Guard does a very good job of responding to emergencies. The Coast Guard here in the United States also liaisons with a number of Coast Guard and military organizations to provide search and rescue support through countries through Central South America, the Caribbean, and even into parts of Europe and Asia. And they usually do a very good job of being able to get on response to a vessel issue within most of those regions within a day or even less. Some of the responses within hours, depending on how close you are to Coast Guard operations. One of the issues that's being addressed as part of the Polar Code, which is going to be an issue that will be in some sense fairly difficult to overcome, is the search and rescue and the safety operation. Right now within the Polar Codes, it states that you have to be able to survive in the lifeboat on food rations in the polar environment for 5 days, just because rescue operations will take at least that long for someone to get there. It's like being out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It's very, very difficult for rescue craft outside of commercial vessels to be able to get to you. So that's a piece of the code that's been very difficult as lifeboat manufacturers and safety manufacturers look at designing and building equipment for that 5-day period. And it's a long time because you are in such frigid waters and frigid conditions. Now, as we look forward to some of the other things that potentially will happen as the Polar Code evolves, there's been a call to look at how do we integrate the ballast water management into this. Also, how do we integrate air pollution into the pollution side of that? So as this code evolves, you're going to see other pieces and parts come into that. Hey, thanks for joining us this week. We really appreciate all the viewers that we have on this channel. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to get notified of when we post new videos across all of our topics. Also, hit that like button on all the videos you like. We invite you to connect with us through our social media, detailed in the banner above and also in the comments section below. If there's anything that we can do for you from a company perspective, whether it's regulatory compliance or risk management, please don't hesitate to reach out to our experts, because we're always happy to steer you in the right direction.